The Reckoning at the Ruhr, April 3rd, 1945. 0900 hours. Temporary headquarters, 1st United States Army, near Lippstadt, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel James Robert Whitmore of the Army's G2 Intelligence Section stared at the prisoner count sheet before him, his hands trembling slightly as he held the morning report. The numbers couldn't be right. In the first 36 hours since the pocket closed, they had processed 47,000 German prisoners. 47,000. He read the figure 3 times, checked the unit reports again, ran his finger down the columns of regimental tallies. His voice emerged as barely a whisper. This can't be accurate. Someone made an error in the zeros. What Whitmore didn't know, as he sat in that converted German office with spring sunlight streaming through windows that still held shattered glass from Allied bombing, was that the number before him represented merely the beginning. The figure that troubled him so deeply that morning would, within 2 weeks, seem almost trivially small. The scale of reality. The mathematics were staggering in ways that would not become fully apparent for days. The Ruhr pocket, formed when elements of the 1st and 9th Armies linked at Lippstadt on April 1st, enclosed approximately 350,000 German troops in an area roughly 50 miles east to west and 70 miles north to south. This represented more German soldiers than had surrendered at Stalingrad 3 years earlier in February 1943. 91,000 men. A defeat that had shocked the world and marked the beginning of Germany's long retreat. The Ruhr would exceed Stalingrad by a ratio of nearly 4 to 1. But raw numbers told only part of the story. At Stalingrad, the Germans had lost a single army, the 6th, already weakened by months of brutal urban combat and a Russian winter. At the Ruhr, they lost effective components of 3 armies, the 5th Panzer Army, 15th Army, and major elements of the 1st Parachute Army, along with portions of several corps and dozens of independent units. Among the prisoners would be 30 generals, including 1 field marshal. The industrial capacity enclosed in the pocket produced more coal and steel than the entire nation of France. The Krupp works alone, spread across Essen and surrounding cities, employed more workers than the total population of many German cities. The world as understood. The campaign that led to this moment had begun with such careful optimism. After the successful Rhine crossings at Remagen on March 7th and Montgomery's massive Operation Plunder near Wesel beginning March 23rd, Allied planners anticipated a steady advance into Germany against stiffening but manageable resistance. Intelligence estimates in late March suggested that Army Group B, under Field Marshal Walter Model, controlled approximately 200,000 troops in the Ruhr region, a substantial force, but one that would, according to conventional military wisdom, conduct a fighting retreat eastward toward the interior of Germany, rather than allow itself to be encircled. Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore, 42 years old, from Cincinnati, Ohio, had served in Army intelligence since North Africa in 1942. He had processed prisoner interrogations after Kasserine Pass, Sicily, Normandy, the Bulge. He understood German military doctrine, had studied their tactical manuals, knew their officers' training emphasized mobility, maneuver, and avoiding encirclement at almost any cost. The trauma of Stalingrad had been seared into every Wehrmacht commander's consciousness. They would not, could not, allow another such catastrophe. The American strategic concept reflected this understanding. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, had designed the Ruhr operation as an envelopment, yes, but one that would serve primarily to cut off supplies and force German units to retreat eastward, where they could be destroyed piecemeal by pursuing Allied forces. The industrial cities would be captured, their production capacity denied to the enemy. but the main German forces would escape to continue fighting. Plans called for perhaps 50 to 70,000 prisoners once the operation concluded. A respectable haul, but nothing extraordinary by the standards of the war's final months. The approach to discovery. The link-up at Lippstadt occurred with almost surprising ease. Major General J. Lawton Collins' 7th Corps, driving northeast from the Remagen bridgehead, and the 2nd Armored Division of the 9th Army, pushing southeast from their Rhine crossing near Wesel, met near Lippstadt in the late afternoon of April 1st, Easter Sunday. The speed of the advance, approximately 200 miles in 8 days. Left staff officers scrambling to update situation maps. In those first chaotic hours, as tank commanders compared maps and radioed for new orders, nobody quite grasped what had been accomplished. Captain Theodore Harrison, 27, from Portland, Oregon, commanding a company of the 2nd Armored 67th Armored Regiment, later described the moment. We were told we'd meet elements of 1st Army near Lippstadt. We drove into this little town, lot of white flags hanging from windows, and there's a column of Shermans with 1st Army markings coming from the other direction. We shook hands, shared some coffee, made jokes about beating Monty to Berlin. One of their lieutenants said something about closing the ring, but I don't think any of us really understood what that meant yet. We were just thinking about the next town, the next objective. The idea that we trapped hundreds of thousands of Germans, that seemed like something out of propaganda, not reality. The first count. The prisoner flow began almost immediately, but in those first hours it seemed manageable, even anticlimactic. Small groups, mostly supply troops, and rear echelon personnel, emerged from the towns surrounding Lippstadt with hands raised, looking exhausted but not particularly traumatized. By nightfall on April 1st, division collection points had processed approximately 3,000 men, standard procedure for a day's advance against retreating forces. But April 2nd brought something different. Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore received his first hint that the numbers might be unusual when a report crossed his desk from the 104th Infantry Division, operating on the southern edge of the pocket. They had processed 12,000 prisoners in a single day. 12,000. Whitmore's first instinct was to question the count. He called the division's G2 section directly. "Are you certain about this figure?" he asked Major Philip Sanderson, the 104th's intelligence officer. Sanderson's voice crackled over the field telephone line. "Sir, I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't seen it. They're not fighting. They're walking out of the woods in company formations, sometimes battalion strength, officers still in command, just looking for someone to surrender to. We've got collection points that look like football stadiums. The MPs are going crazy trying to organize them. We've run out of barbed wire for perimeters, so we're just parking them in open fields with a couple guards, and they're staying put." Whitmore hung up the phone and stared at his situation map. If the 104th had taken 12,000, what about the other divisions? He began calling units systematically. The 3rd Armored Division, 9,000 prisoners. The 8th Infantry Division, 7,500. The 78th Infantry Division, 6,000. By mid-afternoon on April 2nd, he had tallied over 47,000 German prisoners, and reports were still coming in from units too busy processing captives to file complete paperwork. He drafted his morning report for April 3rd with figures he knew would provoke questions from higher headquarters. 47,000 in 36 hours. He added a note. Prisoner count appears anomalous. Request confirmation of divisional tallies. Then he walked to the window and lit a cigarette with shaking hands, wondering if his career had just ended because of some massive clerical error his staff had made. The pattern emerges. April 3rd brought not correction, but amplification. By evening, the cumulative prisoner count exceeded 75,000. First Army headquarters, now relocated to a commandeered German administrative building in Werl, buzzed with confused activity as officers tried to reconcile the numbers with their understanding of German force strength in the region. Colonel Samuel Morrison, 45, from Boston, Massachusetts, First Army's G3 operations officer, called an emergency staff meeting that evening. Whitmore attended, carrying folders thick with interrogation reports and unit tallies. Morrison opened the meeting with characteristic directness. "Gentlemen, either we've made the greatest intelligence failure of the war by underestimating German strength by a factor of 2 or 3, or something very unusual is happening in that pocket. Whitmore, what are the prisoner interrogations telling you?" Whitmore stood, consulting his notes. "Sir, we've conducted detailed interrogations of over 200 prisoners, including 8 officers of rank major or above. Their stories are consistent. They describe units that were ordered to hold defensive positions in the Ruhr cities, specifically told that relief was coming, that this was strategic ground that must not be yielded. Several mentioned specific orders from Field Marshal Model himself, emphasizing that the Ruhr's industrial capacity was vital to Germany's ability to continue the war. So they were ordered to stay and fight," Morrison said. "That explains why they didn't retreat eastward. But it doesn't explain the numbers." "No, sir, it doesn't," Whitmore agreed. "The organizational intelligence is what concerns me most. We're not just seeing line infantry units. Yesterday we processed an entire panzer battalion, tanks and all, out of fuel and abandoning their vehicles. This morning, a flak battalion, 45 anti-aircraft guns, complete with all their equipment. This afternoon, 3 separate artillery battalions. These are specialized units, the kind Germany can't easily replace. And they're surrendering in formed units, not as scattered individuals. Captain Robert Delaney, 31, from Chicago, Illinois, who had been conducting interrogations for the past 2 days, added his own observation. "Sir, permission to speak? The prisoner's mental state is what strikes me most. These aren't men who fought to exhaustion and then gave up. Most of them seem almost relieved. When we ask why they surrendered, they keep saying variations of the same thing. It's over, or the war is finished, or there's no point anymore." One major, veteran of the Russian front with an Iron Cross First Class, told me, and I wrote this down exactly. "When we saw we were surrounded, really surrounded, not just a tactical encirclement, but completely cut off, we knew it was Stalingrad again. But this time we're the ones in the pocket, and everyone remembers what happened to the Sixth Army. Nobody wants to be the last man to die for nothing." The scope becomes visible. By April 5th, the cumulative prisoner count exceeded 120,000, and the implications were beginning to sink into the consciousness of the Allied command structure. General Courtney Hodges, commanding First Army, toured collection points that day, accompanied by his staff. What he witnessed challenged his 33 years of military experience. Near Soest, the 3rd Armored Division had established a temporary prison compound that stretched across 3 large fields. Hodges stood on a slight rise, looking down at what appeared to be a small city of German soldiers. They sat or stood in rough formations, still organized by unit, with their officers maintaining order. The scene had an almost surreal quality. Thousands of armed enemy soldiers who had simply stopped fighting. Major General Maurice Rose, commanding 3rd Armored, accompanied Hodges on the tour. Rose, who would be killed just weeks later in combat, later described the moment in a letter to his wife. "Courtney asked me how many prisoners we had in that field. I told him approximately 18,000. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. 18,000, he said. In one field? I told him yes, sir, and that was just one of our collection points. We had two others nearly as large. He stood there for a long moment, just looking, and then he said something I'll never forget. Maurice, we haven't captured an army. We've captured an entire military district. The scope extended beyond mere numbers. Intelligence officers analyzing captured documents discovered evidence of extensive German supply dumps within the pocket. Captain Ernest Richardson, 29, from Atlanta, Georgia, attached to the First Army's G4 Logistics Section, was assigned to assess captured German stockpiles. His report, filed on April 7th, painted a picture that seemed impossible. Investigation of German supply facilities in Dortmund, Essen, and Bochum reveals fuel stocks totaling approximately 7 million gallons of gasoline and diesel fuel, sufficient to supply 20 panzer divisions for 2 weeks of intensive operations. Ammunition stocks are similarly extensive, including approximately 12,000 tons of artillery shells, 5,000 tons of small arms ammunition, and extensive stocks of Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. Food supplies in military warehouses could sustain 50,000 troops for 6 months. This material was apparently stockpiled for defensive operations, but the rapid pace of Allied advance prevented its effective distribution or evacuation. Richardson's private assessment, shared with colleagues over coffee in the officers' mess, was more direct. They planned to fight. This wasn't a retreat that got cut off. This was a deliberate concentration of forces and supplies for a major defensive stand. Model was going to turn the Ruhr into a fortress. He had the supplies, the troops, the industrial capacity. What he didn't have was time. We closed the ring so fast, he couldn't organize the defense. The quality of forces. As the prisoner count climbed past 150,000 by April 8th, another revelation emerged from the interrogation reports. The quality of the captured forces far exceeded initial estimates. These were not third-rate garrison troops or hastily assembled Volkssturm units of old men and boys. These were frontline Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS formations, many with extensive combat experience. Lieutenant Henry Abrams, 26, from Brooklyn, New York, conducting interrogations at a collection point near Hagen, filed a report that circulated rapidly through First Army headquarters. Subject: Quality Assessment of Prisoner Intake, 7 to 8 April 1945. Have interrogated representatives from following units: 2nd Panzer Division, 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, 130th Panzer Lehr Division, elements of 7th Parachute Division, and multiple independent assault gun and tank destroyer battalions. Approximately 60% of enlisted prisoners show evidence of combat decorations. Officer cadre includes veterans of campaigns in Russia, France, Italy, and North Africa. Average age of enlisted men is 24 years, significantly younger than prisoner populations captured in France during summer 1944. Physical condition generally good, equipment well maintained until recent fuel shortages. Assessment: These represent first-line German military formations, not rear echelon or ersatz units. The implications troubled Whitmore deeply. Each evening he compiled the day's intelligence into a summary report for Army Group Headquarters. On April 9th, he added a personal assessment. The German formations in the Ruhr pocket represent a significantly larger and more capable force than pre-operation intelligence estimated. If Field Marshal Model had chosen to conduct a fighting retreat eastward rather than accepting encirclement, these forces could have prolonged organized German resistance by weeks or possibly months. Instead, they are surrendering en masse. This suggests a fundamental collapse not just of German military capability, but of German military will. at the highest command levels. The industrial heart. As Allied troops pushed deeper into the pocket, they discovered the full extent of what they had captured. The industrial heart of the German war machine, substantially intact. The Krupp works in Essen, which Hitler had once called the arsenal of the Reich, fell to elements of the 79th Infantry Division on April 10th. What they found astonished even the most experienced industrial intelligence specialists. Major Daniel Foster, 34, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, an industrial engineer in civilian life and now attached to the Army's Technical Intelligence Branch, entered the Krupp facilities on April 11th. His subsequent report ran to 47 pages of detailed technical assessment, but his opening paragraph captured the essential reality. The Krupp manufacturing complex in Essen represents the most concentrated industrial war production facility encountered in the European theater of operations. The main works alone encompass over 120 buildings across approximately 750 acres. Despite extensive Allied bombing, including the devastating attacks of March to April 1943 that destroyed much of Essen's residential areas, key production facilities remain substantially operational. Machine tool shops, forge facilities, steel mills, and assembly buildings show damage, but could be returned to production within weeks given adequate labor and raw materials. Stockpiles of finished weapons are extensive. Approximately 240 tanks and assault guns in various stages of completion. Over 600 artillery pieces ranging from 75 to 150 millimeters. And vast quantities of small arms, ammunition, and mechanical components. For Foster, walking through the vast halls where German workers had assembled weapons used against Allied troops throughout the war, the experience carried deep emotional weight. He later wrote to his wife, "I kept thinking about our boys who died fighting against guns and tanks made in these very buildings. All through the war, we bombed these places, lost hundreds of planes and thousands of men trying to shut them down from the air. And now I'm walking through them, mostly intact, with just a few guards watching German workers who've been told to go home. If we'd captured this place 6 months ago, how many lives would have been saved? But then, if Model hadn't decided to defend the Ruhr, if he'd evacuated these facilities and retreated east, how much longer would this war have lasted?" The moment of recognition, on April 14th, marked a turning point both tactically and psychologically. The Allies succeeded in splitting the pocket into two separated segments, eastern and western, cutting the German forces' ability to coordinate their defense. The collapse accelerated dramatically. Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore attended a commander's conference that evening at 1st Army Headquarters. General Hodges began the meeting by announcing the prisoner count. 220,000 and still climbing. The room fell silent. Hodges let the number hang in the air for a long moment before continuing. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of dawning realization, "we need to understand what's happened here. This isn't just a successful envelopment operation. This is the largest surrender of German forces in a single action in the entire war, exceeding even Stalingrad. We have captured, or are in the process of capturing, the equivalent of 30 divisions. 30. That's more divisions than we landed in Normandy on D-Day. And we've done it in 2 weeks." Colonel Morrison, the G3, added his own assessment. "Sir, I've been compiling the unit identifications from prisoner interrogations. We've captured elements of 21 German divisions, plus independent units. The formations include the backbone of German armored forces in the west, 2nd Panzer, 116th Panzer, 3rd Panzer Grenadier, Ninth Panzer. These were the divisions that hit us in the bulge. These were the divisions that were supposed to stop us at the Rhine. And they're sitting in our prison compounds, waiting to be processed. Captain William Bradford, 28, from San Francisco, California, 1st Army's liaison to the 9th Army, offered an observation that captured what many were thinking but hesitant to say. Sirs, with respect, I think we need to consider what this means strategically. If Model had ordered these forces to retreat, if he'd abandoned the Ruhr and pulled back to defend central Germany, we'd be fighting them for months. Instead, he concentrated them, we surrounded them, and now they're out of the war. Not retreating to fight another day. Just out. Finished. The Germans have lost the military capacity to conduct organized large-scale operations in the West. What we're fighting now, and what we'll fight to Berlin, will be fragments. This, he gestured at the maps showing the shrinking pocket. This is where the war in the West actually ended. The human cost inside. As Allied forces tightened their grip on the divided pockets, reports from frontline units began to paint a picture of conditions inside the shrinking German perimeter. The humanitarian situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sergeant Thomas McKinley, 32 from Denver, Colorado, with the 95th Infantry Division, led a patrol that made contact with a German medical unit attempting to surrender on April 15th. His after-action report described what they found. Approached coordinates as ordered and encountered German medics with approximately 200 wounded. Senior German officer, Major Heinz something, couldn't catch the last name, spoke reasonable English. Said they'd been trying to surrender for 3 days, but couldn't find American lines because situation's so confused. Wounded men in terrible shape. Many hadn't received treatment in 48 hours. No morphine, no sulfa drugs, bandages reused and filthy. Major said his medical supplies exhausted, requested we treat his wounded or take them as prisoners. Brought them back to our aid station. Division surgeon said conditions were consistent with total supply breakdown, not just shortage. The German medical officer kept saying, "It's over, it's over. Why won't they let us stop?" The collapse of German command and control within the pocket created chaos. Units lost contact with higher headquarters. Supply networks disintegrated. Communications broke down. Individual battalion and regimental commanders faced a choice. Continue fighting with diminishing supplies against overwhelming odds, or seek terms. Major Albert Hoffman, a German infantry battalion commander who surrendered his unit on April 15th, later provided testimony to Allied interrogators that illuminated the decision calculus. His statement, translated and filed in intelligence records, was extensive. By the 12th of April, my battalion held positions east of Hagen. We numbered approximately 420 men, down from full strength of 780 due to casualties and detachments. Our food supplies consisted of enough bread for 2 more days, no meat, no fresh vegetables. Ammunition adequate for perhaps 2 hours of intense fighting, no fuel for vehicles. Radio contact with regiment lost on April 10th. Orders were to hold position and prepare for counterattack to break encirclement. We waited. No counterattack came. On the 13th, American tanks appeared on both flanks. We engaged with Panzerfaust, destroyed 2 tanks, then withdrew to alternate positions. That night, I called my company commanders together. I told them we had perhaps 1 day before we were overrun. We could fight and die, killing maybe 20 or 30 Americans before being annihilated. Or we could surrender and see our homes again. I am not a coward. I fought in Poland, France, Russia, Italy. I saw Stalingrad. Not personally, but I knew men who were there. I knew what happens when you wait too long to surrender. The decision was unanimous. We burned our unit records, destroyed our weapons' firing pins, and at dawn we marched toward the American lines with white flags. I expected shame. Instead, I felt relief. The command crisis. At the highest levels of the German command structure within the pocket, the psychological burden was even more severe. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, found himself in an impossible position. A talented defensive tactician and a convinced National Socialist, Model had spent the previous 3 years conducting fighting retreats from Russia to France to Germany itself, always trying to preserve his forces, always seeking the next defensible line. Now there was no line to retreat to, and the forces he commanded were trapped. Allied intelligence officers pieced together Model's final days from captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and communications intercepts. The portrait that emerged was of a man caught between military reality and political obligation, between his duty to his soldiers and his loyalty to a regime that no longer had any hope of victory. A captured staff officer from Army Group B headquarters, whose name was redacted from intelligence reports for his protection, provided extensive testimony on April 21st. His account offered insights into Model's thinking during the final days. The Field Marshal understood by April 8th that the situation was hopeless. I was present when he received the final communication from OKW, from Keitel, ordering him to hold the Ruhr and tie down Allied forces. Model's response, which he did not send but spoke aloud. I remember word for word. Tie down Allied forces with what? I am surrounded by 20 American divisions. I command perhaps the equivalent of 15 divisions, and half of them have no fuel, no ammunition, no food. What am I to do? Throw stones. But he did not surrender. His oath was to the Führer, he said. He would not be the field marshal who voluntarily surrendered an army group. If individual commanders chose to surrender their units, that was their decision, their burden. But he would not give the order. The eastern half collapses April 16th brought the surrender of the eastern portion of the divided pocket. The collapse came with stunning speed, entire divisions laying down their arms within hours of each other. First, Army staff officers, accustomed to the grinding pace of breakthrough and exploitation, found themselves overwhelmed by the administrative challenge of processing the surrendering formations. Colonel Lawrence Martinez, 37, from El Paso, Texas, commander of the military police units coordinating prisoner processing, later described the day. We had plans for maybe 10,000 prisoners a day. That seemed generous, more than we'd handled even in France. On the 16th, we processed 68,000. 68,000 in one day. We ran out of everything. Barbed wire, ration packs, medical supplies, even pencils for the documentation. We were just pointing German units toward empty fields and telling them to wait there. Most of them were so relieved to be done fighting they'd have waited anywhere. I saw entire battalions sitting in formation, officers still in command, just waiting for someone to tell them where to go next. It was the most orderly mass surrender I could imagine, and it was absolutely overwhelming. The psychological impact on American troops witnessing this collapse varied. Some felt vindication, seeing it as proof that the war was truly ending. Others felt discomfort at the sheer scale of human defeat on display. Private First Class Jonathan Wheeler, 21, from Seattle, Washington, serving as a guard at a collection point, wrote to his parents on April 17th, "You see these German soldiers, Mom, and they look just like regular guys. Tired, dirty, hungry, but regular guys. Some of them are younger than me. They're sitting there in these huge fields, thousands of them, and they just look relieved it's over. Yesterday I was guarding a group of maybe 500, and this one German who spoke English asked me, 'Is the war finished now?' I I didn't know what to say. I mean, for them it's finished, right? But we're still fighting. I told him I didn't know. He nodded and said, "For us it is finished. That is enough." It made me think about how this all ends, you know? Not with some big dramatic moment, just with guys being too tired and too hungry and too done to keep going. The western half holds. Briefly, the western portion of the pocket, centered on Essen and the Krupp works, held out for 2 more days. These were not days of intense combat, but rather the gradual disintegration of remaining German resistance as supplies exhausted and commanders faced reality. Allied intelligence intercepted increasingly desperate German communications. One transmission, recorded on April 17th, came from a German regimental commander to his division headquarters. "Have no ammunition for artillery. Have no fuel for vehicles. Have food for 1 more day. American tanks visible on 3 sides. Request permission to negotiate local ceasefire for evacuation of, civilians." The response, "Hold positions. Help is coming." No help came. Major General Raymond McLean, commanding the 19th Corps attacking the Western Pocket, later reflected on the disconnect between the intensity of the tactical situation and the sense of inevitability that pervaded both sides. We were advancing, taking objectives, but there was this strange feeling that we were just going through the motions. The Germans would fire some small arms, pull back, we'd move forward, repeat. Nobody on either side was really fighting anymore. They were waiting for permission to stop, and we were waiting for them to realize the permission wasn't coming from their headquarters, so they'd have to give it to themselves. The final surrender. April 18th marked the formal surrender of the remaining German forces in the Western Pocket. Unlike the Eastern section, which had collapsed in waves of individual unit surrenders, the Western Pocket negotiated a more organized capitulation. German officers requested a meeting to discuss terms. Allied commanders granted it, though there were no terms to discuss beyond unconditional surrender. The meeting occurred in the early afternoon at Dusseldorf, with representatives from the remaining German Corps commanders meeting American officers from First Army. The German delegation was led by General Joseph Harp, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, who would later die in Soviet custody. The meeting was brief and businesslike. Major Charles Wilson, 30, from Richmond, Virginia, who served as translator at the meeting, recorded the key exchange in his diary. Harp opened by stating that his forces had fought with honor, that they had obeyed all orders given to them, and that they were now in an impossible position through no fault of their own. Our colonel, whose name I won't write here, cut him off politely and said that we understood, that everyone had fought bravely, but that there was only one question that mattered. Were the German forces prepared to surrender immediately and unconditionally? Harp hesitated, looked at his fellow officers, and then said yes. The whole meeting took maybe 15 minutes. 350,000 men, more or less, changed from combatants to prisoners because of that 15-minute conversation. By evening of April 18th, the fighting in the Ruhr Pocket had ceased. The final prisoner count would take days to compile accurately, but preliminary tallies suggested approximately 325,000 German soldiers captured. The count of high-ranking officers reached 30, including 5 lieutenant generals, 12 major generals, and 13 brigadier generals. Among the captured units, intelligence officers identified elements of 28 divisions, ranging from Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions to parachute infantry and Volksgrenadier formations. The reckoning Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore spent the evening of April 18th compiling his final intelligence summary on the Ruhr Pocket operation. The document ran to 38 pages, filled with unit identifications, prisoner statistics, captured equipment inventories, and strategic assessments. But it was his final paragraph that captured the magnitude of what had occurred. The encirclement and reduction of German forces in the Ruhr pocket represents the most decisive single operation of the war in Western Europe. In 18 days from pocket closure to final surrender, Allied forces captured more German soldiers than surrendered at Stalingrad, more than surrendered in North Africa in May 1943, more than surrendered in the Falaise pocket in August 1944. The destruction of Army Group B eliminates Germany's capacity to conduct sustained defensive operations west of the Elbe River. Remaining German forces in the west lack the organizational structure, equipment, and supply infrastructure to resist Allied advance toward the heart of Germany. The war, for practical purposes, has been decided. He paused, pen hovering over the paper, then added one more sentence. What we failed to appreciate until the pocket closed was not that the Germans would fight for the Ruhr, but that Field Marshal model would allow them to be trapped there. The missing Field Marshal, one significant figure, did not appear among the surrendering officers. Field Marshal Walter Model himself. His fate remained unknown through late April, sparking speculation and investigation. The answer came on April 21st. A patrol from the 104th Infantry Division discovered Model's body in woods near Duisburg. He had shot himself on April 21st. A brief suicide note was found, addressed to his wife, containing only personal matters. No official explanation, no justification, no final military testament. When news of Model's suicide reached First Army headquarters, it provoked somber reflection among Allied officers who had spent weeks fighting against his defensive skills. General Hodges issued a brief statement acknowledging Model's death and recognizing his military abilities without commenting on the political allegiances that had led him to serve the Nazi regime until the end. Captain Bradford, the Army liaison who had articulated the strategic significance of the Ruhr pocket's collapse, learned of Model's death while reviewing interrogation reports. His private observation, recorded in his diary, reflected on the human dimension of the catastrophe. Model chose death over surrender, death over the responsibility of ordering his army group to give up. I don't know if that makes him a fanatic or a man crushed by impossible contradictions. He let 300,000 men surrender, but he couldn't order it himself. He couldn't be the field marshal who gave up. So he let his subordinates do it, unit by unit, and then he shot himself in the woods rather than live with what he'd allowed to happen. There's something profoundly tragic about that, even for an enemy. He couldn't save his men by ordering surrender, and he couldn't face the consequence of their individual surrenders. So everyone lost. The prisoners' march. The logistics of moving over 300,000 prisoners westward toward permanent POW camps challenged the Allied supply system. The columns of German soldiers marching under guard toward the Rhine created their own strange spectacle. A river of defeated men flowing counter to the Allied advance. Sergeant David Kramer, 24, from Minneapolis, Minnesota, assigned to escort a column of 5,000 prisoners from Dortmund to collection points near the Rhine, described the experience. They marched in formation, mostly, units still together, officers still in charge of their men. We didn't have enough trucks to transport them all, so they walked. 10, 15, sometimes 20 miles a day. They looked worn out, obviously, but not beaten down. There was no defiance, but also no humiliation. They'd just stopped fighting. Every few hours we'd halt for rest, and they'd sit by the roadside and wait for the next order. I remember thinking how different this was from what I'd expected. I'd always imagined enemy surrender as either desperate panic or broken defeat. This was neither. It was just done, finished, a giant machine that had run out of fuel and rolled to a stop. The march of prisoners also created unexpected encounters between captor and captive. The shared experience of survival, the recognition of common humanity, sometimes broke through the barriers of enmity. Lieutenant Robert Zimmerman, 27, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with the 3rd Armored Division, later wrote about one such encounter. "We were escorting a German panzer battalion, or what was left of it, guys who'd fought tanks against tanks for years. During a rest stop, one of their officers spoke perfect English. Turned out he'd studied mechanical engineering at Michigan before the war. Asked if he could look at one of our Shermans. Our tank commander said sure, why not? This German officer walked around the Sherman, knelt down to look at the suspension, stood up and said, 'This is what beat us. Not the gun is adequate, not the armor is sufficient. This,' he tapped the engine compartment, 'this engine that you can replace in 6 hours. Our Panthers and Tigers were better tanks, technically superior, but when they broke, which they often did, we needed 3 days and a factory to fix them. You could swap engines in a field. The war was lost in Detroit and Essen, not at the front.' Then he saluted our tank commander, the way one professional acknowledges another, and walked back to join his men. It was the strangest moment of the war for me." The industrial aftermath. As military authorities processed the human consequences of the Ruhr's fall, industrial intelligence teams assessed the material capture. The figures, compiled over weeks of surveys and inventories, revealed the scale of Germany's industrial commitment to defending the region. Colonel Edwin Harris, 39, from Cleveland, Ohio, Chief of 1st Army's Economic Intelligence Section, submitted his comprehensive report on May 1st. The inventory included approximately 2,000 industrial facilities of military significance, 312 of them major manufacturing plants, coal stocks totaling over 1 million tons, steel production capacity equivalent to approximately 7 million tons annually, machine tool inventory sufficient to equip 20 additional factories. The Krupp Works alone contained enough raw materials and components to produce an additional 500 tanks if production could have continued uninterrupted. Harris's assessment concluded with an observation that highlighted the strategic calculus behind Model's decision to defend the Ruhr. Germany's decision to concentrate forces in defense of the Ruhr region was not irrational from their perspective. These industrial facilities represented the only remaining heavy manufacturing capacity under German control. Loss of the Ruhr meant loss of ability to replace tanks, artillery, ammunition on any significant scale. From this perspective, risking even an entire army group to defend this industrial capacity made strategic sense. What made the decision catastrophic was not the commitment to defend the Ruhr, but the failure to recognize how quickly Allied mobile forces could achieve encirclement, and the failure to withdraw before the trap closed. By the time Model fully grasped his situation, extraction was impossible. The comparative scale. As April ended and May began, military historians and analysts within Allied headquarters began placing the Ruhr operation in comparative perspective. The numbers, fully compiled, exceeded even the estimates made during the campaign. Final accounting recorded 325,000 German prisoners, though some sources suggested the actual figure might have reached 350,000 when including ad hoc formations and rear echelon personnel. The 30 generals included 1 field marshal posthumously counted, 5 lieutenant generals, 12 major generals, and 13 brigadier generals. Equipment captured or destroyed included approximately 750 armored vehicles of all types, 1,300 artillery pieces, 6,000 support vehicles, and personal weapons for 28 divisions. Compared to other major prisoner halls of the war, the Ruhr stood alone. Stalingrad had yielded 91,000 prisoners. Tunisia, in May 1943, netted approximately 245,000 Axis prisoners. But these included Italian troops and represented a multi-month campaign. The Falaise Pocket in August 1944 trapped approximately 50,000 Germans. Even the massive Soviet offensives in the east rarely captured more than 150,000 prisoners in a single encirclement. More significantly, the Ruhr represented a different kind of defeat than these precedents. At Stalingrad, the Germans had fought to literal annihilation, with only a remnant surrendering. In Tunisia, the Axis forces included many Italian units already demoralized by defeats. At Falaise, significant German forces escaped the trap despite Allied efforts. At the Ruhr, elite German formations, well-equipped and substantially intact, chose to surrender rather than continue a hopeless fight. This was not defeat by destruction, but defeat by despair. Not annihilation, but acknowledgement. The psychological victory for Allied troops, particularly American soldiers who had fought from Normandy through to the Rhine. The Ruhr Pocket's collapse provided psychological confirmation that the war was ending. The seemingly inexhaustible German capacity for resistance, which had shocked Allied planners during the Bulge Offensive just 4 months earlier, had finally exhausted itself. Private First Class Marcus Johnson, 19, from Detroit, Michigan, with the 8th Infantry Division, expressed a common sentiment in a letter home, dated April 25th. Mom, Dad, I think it's really over. Not officially yet, but really over. We captured so many Germans in the Ruhr that they say it's more than surrendered anywhere else in the war. These guys who were fighting us tooth and nail all through France and Belgium, they just stopped. They're done. They know they lost. When I see them marching past under guard, I don't see the enemy anymore. I just see guys who want to go home, like me. Maybe we'll all get to go home soon. The psychological impact extended beyond individual soldiers to command decisions. The Ruhr's collapse convinced Eisenhower and his senior commanders that German capacity for organized resistance in the West had effectively ended. This assessment influenced decisions about objectives and advance rates in the final weeks of the war. The strategic meaning, in the final analysis, the Ruhr encirclement achieved far more than its tactical objectives. By trapping and eliminating Army Group B, the operation removed the last substantial German force capable of defending Western and Central Germany. The path to the Elbe River and link up with Soviet forces lay open. More critically, the operation demonstrated to remaining German commanders that further resistance was futile. The speed of the collapse, fewer than 3 weeks from encirclement to final surrender, shocked military professionals on both sides. Traditional military doctrine suggested that a force of over 300,000 troops defending urban and industrial terrain with adequate supplies could hold out for months against even overwhelming attackers. The rapid surrender indicated something beyond military calculation. A psychological collapse at the command level. A recognition that the war was lost and further sacrifice pointless. This psychological collapse proved contagious. German commanders in other sectors, observing the Ruhr's fate, became increasingly unwilling to fight to the last man. Surrender became, if not acceptable, at least conceivable. The final 3 weeks of the war in Europe would see a cascade of surrenders as remaining German forces, cut off from any hope of meaningful resistance, chose survival over sacrifice. The final irony, the Ruhr encirclement, which seemed to Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore on April 3rd to be the product of some massive clerical error, actually represented something far more significant than anyone initially understood. The 325,000 prisoners captured exceeded by nearly 4-to-1 the number captured at Stalingrad, an event that had seemed to define the limits of military catastrophe. Yet Stalingrad had become a German symbol of tragic heroism, the last stand of brave men sacrificed to political miscalculation. The Ruhr, by contrast, disappeared rapidly from historical consciousness, overshadowed by the final drive to Berlin and the revelation of Nazi death camps. What made the Ruhr significant was not heroic sacrifice, but its absence. 325,000 German soldiers chose existence over extinction, survival over useless death. In doing so, they rendered their sacrifice unnecessary, turned tragedy into mere defeat. History remembers dramatic last stands, not sensible surrenders, no matter how large. Museum, May 1995. 50 years after the Ruhr pocket's collapse, the German War Museum in Essen houses a small exhibition on the campaign. Among the artifacts is a faded military map, showing American 1st and 9th Army positions forming a shrinking circle around the industrial heart of Germany. Beside it hangs a photograph of Field Marshal Walter Model, formal and unsmiling in his Wehrmacht uniform. A group of school children, German and American together on an exchange program, stand before the exhibit. Their teacher, a woman in her 60s whose father fought in the Wehrmacht, explains the significance. The Battle of the Ruhr was the largest surrender in German military history. Over 300,000 soldiers laid down their arms. Some people said they betrayed Germany. Others said they chose life over pointless death. What do you think? A German boy, perhaps 14, raises his hand. Were they cowards? He asks. The teacher considers the question carefully. 300,000 men marched into Allied prison camps. They survived the war. They went home to their families. They rebuilt Germany. If they had fought to the last man, as some wanted, they would be dead. Would that have been braver? Or would it simply have been more death for no purpose? An American girl, same age, looks at Model's photograph. What about him? The field marshal? He killed himself instead of surrendering. Was he brave or coward? That, the teacher says quietly, is a question each of you must answer for yourselves. He let his soldiers surrender, but he would not order it. He could not live with the responsibility of such a surrender, but he also could not demand his men die with him. History judges him harshly for serving the Nazi regime, but perhaps in the end, he saved 300,000 lives by allowing what he could not command. The students move on to the next exhibit, their questions unanswered because some questions have no simple answers. Behind them, the map and photograph remain, silent witnesses to the day when 325,000 German soldiers stopped fighting. And the war in the West ended not with glory, but with exhaustion, not with heroism, but with relief, not with a last stand, but with a quiet, massive, and utterly complete surrender that changed nothing except that it let those who survived survive. The mathematics were staggering, the scale unprecedented, the transformation absolute. 325,000 German soldiers, the equivalent of 30 divisions, the largest surrender in German military history. More prisoners than Stalingrad, more than Tunisia, more than any single engagement in the European theater. And history barely remembers, because they chose to live rather than die. And history forgets survival, but memorializes sacrifice. What Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore discovered on that April morning, when the numbers first crossed his desk and seemed impossible, was not error, but truth. The moment when Germany's capacity to resist in the West simply ended, not with defiant destruction, but with quiet acceptance that the war was finished. and survival mattered more than fighting to the end. The Ruhr taught a simple lesson. The greatest military catastrophes are not always the ones where everyone dies fighting. Sometimes they are the ones where everyone lives by surrendering. And the magnitude of defeat is measured not in heroic deaths, but in hundreds of thousands of men who simply stopped fighting and went home.